Alright, so here we are yet again for another video, and this one is actually pretty brief. We're going to be discussing the very beginning of Chapter 18, which covers land resources, so basically how we use the land on Earth. And you can see this table, or this graph from your book, land use divided worldwide. Most of land, you can see, 30% of land is either just plain ice or rock, tundra, desert. Basically, this includes anything that you can't really do much with in terms of development. You may be surprised to see that urban areas are 3%. So 3% of the Earth's surface is, or Earth's land surface is covered with cities, and this is a high-density city. And you can see the other uses here: forests and permanent pasture. This is where, rangelands and where animals graze are about 26%. And in class, we'll look at how these figures compare to the United States. And in terms of a map of the United States, you can see the different land uses on the side, so farming and grazing, and then the forested areas and the urban areas. So you can just see how this looks across our country. And you can see a lot is forested, and if you kind of blur your eyes a little bit, the red really isn't very dominant, but there sure is a lot of farmland and grazing land. So we do, although it's not urban, we certainly use a lot of land for different purposes in the United States. And then this is another map showing the protected areas in the United States. So basically this talk, I'm going to be talking about 4 different types of protected areas. We have national forests, wildlife refuges, and national parks. And then what's not on here is a type of protected land called wilderness. It's actually a technical term, a type of land protection status. So you can see where these different types of protected areas are in our country. Might want to compare, the east part of the United States to the western part of the United States. Very different kind of levels of protection for each of those, which is interesting too. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 4 different, as I mentioned just a second ago, the 4 different types of protected areas in the United States. All of these 3 plus, where did my pointer go? These 3 plus wilderness. And I'm going to go in order of how protected they are. What the level or the level of protection each of these different areas has, from least protected to most protected. So U.S. national forests are designated land, and I guess, if I were in class, I'd be, every time I'm saying protected, I'd be, doing my little air quotes, because protection means a lot of different things. So the U.S. national forests were started in 1891. There are over 150 in the United States, and altogether there's twice the area. The U.S. national forests cover twice the area of other protected areas in the country. So there's quite a lot of land, and it's mostly managed by the U.S. Forest Service. So that's easy to remember because the national forests are managed by the Forest Service, and a bit by the Bureau of Land Management. And these acronyms I'll be using later. So okay, so it's protected, meaning you can't build, cities there, but you can still log. So national forests, a lot of logging happens, and one of the reasons they were established in 1891 was so that we could use them for forestry. And you can also mine there and hunt, and can also have recreation. So as you can see, these types of activities aren't allowed in a place like Yellowstone or Yosemite. All the recreation is, but certainly not logging. So of all the national park, or all the kind of protected areas, this serves or receives the least amount of protection. And then road building and clear cutting. So this would be a type of logging that we'll discuss where it's all cut at once as opposed to kind of selective logging. These are very controversial issues, and the ability to do these activities in national forests really goes back and forth in Congress depending on who's in office. In some terms, road building is allowed, in others it's not. So kind of interesting. Okay, so if you look at the national forests in our country, you can see all over the country, again, mostly in the west. And these numbers are the largest forests in the country, and you can see we have quite a lot in California. It's kind of cool. And then these are the national forests in California. So Sequoia National Forest, Lake Tahoe Basin is a national forest. Los Padres National Forest, you may have heard of. They had the fires about 5 years ago that took place in the summer. I don't know if you remember that, but it was a pretty big deal. Okay, so you can see all the forests there. All right, so the next one is a wildlife refuge. And we have lots of wildlife refuges all across the country. So Roosevelt established this system in 1903, and he was a great pioneer in kind of conservation in this country. And he set up quite a lot of protected land. There are 584 all across the United States, and again, the national forests cover more land area, so there are more of these wildlife refuges, but they represent all the major ecosystems, but the total land area then is less than the forest. And they're managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So you can remember that, Wildlife Refuge, Fish and Wildlife Service. And the goal is to preserve these habitats, so a little bit higher protection than the forests, but you're still able to use resources in terms of hunting and fishing. So kind of what's thought of as a little bit more renewable resources. Something like mining would not be permitted. So they do have some more protection than the national forests. Okay, so here's a map of the wildlife refuge system across the United States. You can see all of the black dots, so they're quite a lot. Even Alaska and Hawaii and the islands. So you have high concentration on the East Coast this time, which is good. And then in California, maybe some of you know of the Don Edwards Wildlife Refuge. It's as you're going across the Dumbarton Bridge. And let's take a look at some of the other ones. Again, I would never test you on specific ones, but you should just be aware of what's around you. So that's what we have here in California. Okay, so the third one are national parks, and these have even more protection than the wildlife refuges. Their first one, Yellowstone, was the first national park in 1872. Turns out Yosemite was actually the first park. Yosemite was designated as a protected, just a place that had protection before Yellowstone, but Yellowstone was the first national park, if that makes sense. Yosemite was designated national park after Yellowstone was, even though before that it was still a protected area. So there are 58 in the United States, and they're managed by the National Park Service. So that's kind of easy to remember. National parks by the National Park Service. And they can only be used for recreation and education. So, just think about what you're allowed to do when you go to Yosemite. You can't hunt, you can't log. They have this policy of natural regulation, which means, when you regulate a habitat, you basically try to control it. Regulating population numbers would probably entail some sort of culling or hunting to take population levels down. And in national parks, they have a policy of natural regulation. So you don't do that. You don't manipulate population numbers. And there's a little bit in your book about this, but in terms of introducing species to it, unless you're reintroducing a species that was extirpated from the area, you just kind of let things run the course of nature. And there are becoming more and more problems with tourist crowds and pollution, as you probably would imagine, because the national parks are, such pretty areas, and a lot of people want to see them. So, being able to manage the crowds is definitely something that the people who work at these places are constantly striving to improve upon. All right, so you can see all the national parks in the country. Kind of cool. You got Yosemite over here, Sequoia, some really great ones in our state alone. Glacier National Park, No, Yellowstone. So we've got a lot. Mesa Verde, that was the one that had the pictures of those um, kind of old settlements under the mountain when we were talking about solar energy. That's what that was. So, and it's certainly a lot in Alaska. Okay, and then the last designation is called wilderness, and these are the most protected. And these are where people can hike and camp. There aren't even any bikes or vehicles allowed at all. So these have the most protection. They were started by the Wilderness Act in 1964, and there are quite a lot, but they're very small in terms of their area. And so what basically, you can see how the time that they were established is much later than all the other protected areas. And so essentially what they did was, for these over 750, they kind of set aside areas within parks, the existing national parks, refuges, national forests, that would have even greater protection than they currently did. So it's not like they found brand new land, because a lot of it had been already protected, but they just kind of designated certain special places within these already protected areas that would receive even more protection. So if they are in these already established protected areas, what agencies do you think they'd be managed by? Well, all the agencies that manage those above, which would include the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management. So they all help to manage these wilderness areas. And you can see all the wilderness areas in the United States. So quite a lot. And then in California, and there's this kind of neat web page where you can click and you can see how the Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, that's Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and National Park Service, these indicate, which, obviously it's color-coded by which agency is in control of which part of the wilderness area. So good and bad, there's a lot of people doing it, but there's also a diffusion of responsibility issue where, too many cooks in the kitchen or too many people trying to do the same thing, that everybody kind of passes off the responsibility. But if you're in charge of one area, hopefully actually do your job. Okay, and so that's it. So hopefully you're able to remember this for Monday, because on Monday we're going to start running, and you guys are going to be making a table of all of these kind of different stats and kind of looking at a map of California specifically. Okay, hope you have a great weekend. Thanks.